at the forefront of which are the aggressive Israeli policies that violate Syria's sovereignty and that carry out incursions into its lands and perpetrate violations against its people, and its quest to weaken the Syrian state and affect its national unity by attacking it outright and by setting the fires of discourse and fanning the flames of existing tensions. All of this aims to establish a new fait accompli of occupation that is in line with the expansionist schemes of the occupation, which are a blatant and dangerous violation of international law and the basis of stable international relations and a direct threat to the sovereignty of countries and to regional and international peace and security here. Syria renews its call upon the Security Council to condemn the Israeli attacks and to oblige the Israeli occupation authorities to withdraw their forces from the Syrian territories that it has been present in over the past few months, and to end its occupation of the Syrian Golan in accordance with relevant United Nations resolutions, at the forefront of which are resolutions 242, 338, and 497.
We welcome the Syrian government's actions to conduct comprehensive investigations and hold accountable all perpetrators of the recent violence, as well as its steps to increase the flow of aid, restore public services, and return displaced persons to their homes. We also welcome the Syrian government's pledge to fully cooperate with the UN to investigate crimes and to coordinate with the relevant UN agencies to support the flow of vital humanitarian aid.
Cases of violence based on ethno-confessional grounds require thorough and impartial investigation, holding perpetrators accountable. We look forward to the publication of the full report of the results of the Commission of Inquiry established to investigate the many cases of violence in the western coastal regions of Syria, and we hope to discuss them in the Council. We expect that the interim authorities in Syria will also react to the presidential statement of the Council from the 10th of August, calling for a reliable, immediate, transparent, impartial, and comprehensive investigation of the events in Sueda. This is important to strengthen the authority of the Damascus authorities and trust by the population of Syria.
The humanitarian situation in Syria is further exacerbated by the worst drought in decades, with wheat production collapsing by 40%. The A3+ takes note that over 2.3 million Syrians have returned to their area of origin. While encouraging, these returns takes place amid severe gaps, which must be addressed if they are to be sustainable.
China supports the Syrian interim authorities in continuing to engage in extensive dialogue and communication with all parties concerned in accordance with the principles set out in Council Resolution 2254 in order to promote an inclusive political transition process. We note that the Syrian interim authorities have enacted a decree on the interim People's Assembly elections and are expected to complete parliamentary elections by mid-September.
First of all, there is an urgent need to restore civil peace. Violence in the region of Sueda in mid-July echoed the abuses in the coastal region at the start of March.
We call on the removal of remaining sanctions for the Syrian administration to deliver and serve its citizens. With sustained regional cooperation and international support, these efforts can deliver results more quickly than many expect. Mr. President, we all agree that the vision for a new Syria must be one where all communities, faiths, and cultures feel equally respected and protected, where coexistence replaces division and unity is not only preserved but strengthened.
Declaro abierta la
The 9,983rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Qatar, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Geir Peterson, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, and Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I give the floor to Mr. Geir Peterson. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we meet today, Syrians in Damascus and elsewhere, inside and outside Syria, are marking the somber anniversary of the Ghouta chemical weapons attack of 2013. A painful reminder of the suffering endured by Syrian civilians and of the grave abuses and violations of international law that must never be repeated. As we reflect, I urge this Council to redouble its efforts towards accountability, protection of civilians, and renewed commitment to helping Syria emerge from a dark past towards a brighter future. Mr. President, turning to this month's developments, let me at the outset welcome the clear and united message from the Security Council in your 10 August presidential statement following last month's horrific escalation in Sweden. While violence there has largely subsided following a ceasefire, the threat of renewed conflict is ever present, as are the political centrifugal forces that threaten Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity. Mr. President, in Sweden, the ceasefire agreed on 19 July has come under strain, but so far has prevented a slide back into open conflict. I welcome the efforts of the US, Jordan, and Syrian authorities in forming a trilateral working group to support the ceasefire. That said, we are still seeing dangerous hostilities and skirmishes on the margins of Sweden, and violence could resume at any moment. Absent more tangible and binding measures, including to build confidence, the ceasefire risks remaining fragile, an interim truce rather than the foundation for lasting stability. Israel's airstrikes have subsided following the latest ceasefire, but IDF ground operations in southwest Syria have continued. Such actions are unacceptable. We must insist on full respect for Syria's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, underscored by adherence to the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement. I welcome a ministerial level meeting between Syria and Israel in Paris this week. There is clear scope to address the issues diplomatically and without further confrontation. Mr. President, tragically, the humanitarian cost of recent violence has only escalated. Over 185,000 people have been displaced across Sweda, Dara, and the rural Damascus and beyond. Many are living in precarious conditions with extensive damage to infrastructure compounding their plight. Commercial and humanitarian access challenges to enter Sweda remain very challenging and often disrupted, with periodic road closures and insecurity at contact points. Emergency Coordinator Fletcher will brief you more in detail on this and UN efforts to scale up emergency efforts. And, Mr. President, I am concerned that the month of relative military calm belies a worsening political climate with escalatory and zero-sum rhetoric hardening among many. Part of this has been fueled by the emergence of further distressing footage of graphic abuses that took place inside Sweda during the escalation. At the same time, the formation of a committee to oversee governance inside Sweda and some individual appeals for support from external parties has fueled accusations of separatist intentions. We are closely monitoring the situation in Sweda and remaining in contact with the parties and communities concerned and encouraging steps towards de-escalation and access. Mr. President, we note the interim authorities' response to Sweda, including a statement of condemnation after footage emerged showing the execution of an unarmed man in the medical uniform in Sweda National Hospital. The interim Ministry of Justice also announced the formation of a fact-finding committee tasked with investigating the abuses committed in Sweda. It is essential that the committee's findings are made fully public and that all perpetrators, regardless of affiliation, are held responsible. These events underscore the urgent need for the interim authority security forces to demonstrate that they are acting solely to protect all Syrians and do not constitute a threat. Moreover, leaders on all sides must take a responsibility to counter divisive narratives and promote a shared vision that reflects the rights and security of all communities in Syria. The recent report of the UN Commission on Inquiry documents ongoing violations in coastal and western central Syria throughout the first months of 2025. The interim authorities have publicly acknowledged this report. Its conclusions underline the urgent need for transitional justice measures. Progress cannot be delayed. The separate report submitted last month to President Shara by the Syrian Committee for Investigating and Fact-Finding must be published. Justice for victims and accountability for all perpetrators, regardless of affiliation, are binding obligations under international laws and standards and under the Constitutional Declaration. Mr. President, if future violence and violations are to be avoided, a serious program on security sector reform and on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration is clearly needed, as also called for in the UN Commission of Inquiry report. Mr. President, let me join you and the Security Council in underlining the importance of countering all forms of terrorism in Syria and expressing grave concern over the acute threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters at large in Syria. The Syrian authorities have made commitments and taken actions to counter ISIL and Al-Qaeda, and it is vital that they take the decisive measures to address the threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters. Mr. President, as the Council reaffirmed, an inclusive Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process based on the key principles listed in Resolution 2254 is essential. One that safeguards the rights of all, protects all, meets the legitimate aspirations of all, and enables the Syrian people to determine their own future peacefully, independently, and democratically. In this regard, I note yesterday's publication of the decree that establishes a framework for holding indirect elections for 2/3 of the members of the Interim People's Assembly. My office continues to engage with the Supreme Committee for Elections on their work, and we now await confirmation of the electoral timeframe and the distribution of seats across governorates. I reiterate my previous recommendations. Success in this process demands measures that ensure transparency and openness, and where all major Syrian groups, not just trusted individuals, are included as electors and candidates with the equal and visible participation of women. We recognize that this is a major challenge in areas where disputes remain with the central authorities, but anything less would entrench skepticism, aggravate the forces pulling Syria apart, and impede reconciliation. Moreover, Mr. President, Syria needs to feel that this transition is not a series of ad hoc arrangements and isolated institutions, but a clear and comprehensive path based on inclusion and transparency to implement the principles of Resolution 2254, culminating in a new constitution drafted through popular consensus and resulting in free and fair elections. I hope that the interim authorities can respond to the gravity of the challenge with a clear vision for a path forward, taking bold moves and course recorrections where necessary. As part of this, I urge comprehensive and institutionalized engagement with all communities and leaders, including those critical of the interim authorities, in the spirit of real compromise. Equally, I remind the leadership of other Syrian constituencies and communities of their responsibility to show that they want to be part of united Syria and are willing to engage in action and not just in word, in a peaceful transition that restores Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity. Mr. President, let me here say a word on the Northeast, where efforts continue to implement the 10th March agreement. Attempts to convene the two sides outside of Syria continued, but were not successful so far. We have also seen concerning spikes of violence between interim security forces and the SDF during August in Aleppo Governorate. We do welcome reported further contacts between interim authority officials and SDF representatives. I hope that such contacts can be cemented into real compromise, and we are continuing to engage both sides on the importance of this and the need for urgent substantive progress on the agreed goal of implementing the 10th March agreement before the end of the year. Mr. President, my office continues to hold regular consultations through the Civil Society Support Room with a broad range of Syrian civil society organizations active in strengthening community dialogue, social cohesion, and service delivery in all parts of Syria. I encourage the interim authorities to create an enabling environment for civil society initiatives and dialogue, which are essential for promoting inclusion, transparency, and legitimacy in the transitional process. Mr. President, my office also hears from Syrian women who continue to stress the necessity of women's meaningful political participation. But we also learn from these women the fears associated with their political participation and engagement, including concerns stemming from threats to personal security and social pressure to refrain from political engagement. Mr. President, as we look toward the voluntarily safe and dignified return of refugees and IDPs to their homes, let me stress the need for sustained and coordinated support for Syria's reconstruction and the rehabilitation of its infrastructure. The damage to physical assets, social systems, and livelihoods remains profound. Syria needs tangible international support of an epic scale. Recent decisions to lift certain sanctions represent a significant step in this regard. But these measures must be sustained and broadened, accompanied by substantial funding to reinforce their impact for recovery and reconstruction. And Mr. President, it remains the case that the best way to secure such support is through a genuine political transition that lays the path for long-term stability and sustainable governance. Indeed, without credible reforms, stronger institutions, and a firm commitment to the rule of law, international support risks being squandered or misdirected. To conclude, Mr. President, despite worrying security incidents, the situation has been relatively calmer this month, and I applaud the efforts of all involved in quelling military hostilities. But the country remains deeply fragile, and the transition remains on a knife edge. Across the range of issues in the political transition, including the People's Assembly, the constitutional issues, security sector reform and disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, transitional justice, and the peaceful integration of all parts of Syria and the restoration of Syria's sovereignty and unity, the United Nations is working to support a credible, inclusive, and transparent process, working with the Syrian authorities and all Syrians. The path to a sovereign, peaceful, and inclusive Syria will demand the courage to compromise, the discipline to follow the rule of law, and the wisdom to remember, as interim President Shara himself said this week, that unity is built not through force and bloodshed, but through understanding and dialogue. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al señor Peters.
I thank Mr. Peterson for the information. I now give the floor to Mr. Tom Fletcher. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Special Envoy Pedersen has conveyed the precarity of the moment, and I want to reinforce that message and add 4 points. First, as the situation in Asueda reminds us, the humanitarian crisis is not over. Across Syria, 16 million Syrians still need humanitarian support. While, as you heard, the ceasefire in Asueda has largely held, sporadic clashes continue. Alarming reports of abuses during the earlier fighting continue to emerge. More than 185,000 people have been displaced across Asueda, Dara, rural Damascus, and beyond. This week, our teams have visited Asueda city, Salkad towns, and the western countryside of the governorate. They delivered aid and assessed needs. The overall situation is, I'm afraid, dire. We need to sustain urgent delivery of food, health, shelter, clean water, fuel, restoration of water and electricity infrastructure, education. In some areas, those arriving now outnumber the existing population. Services are overwhelmed. We're in close contact with the Syrian authorities and coordinating with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, who have delivered 12 convoys of essential aid, and NGO partners. We have provided emergency food packages, flour, essential household items to tens of thousands of people, including displaced families. Medical kits are reaching key hospitals in Asueda and Dara. while medical teams are providing health and nutrition services. And UNICEF is working with partners to provide bottled water, water trucking, and fuel for water pumping. The Syrian Arab Red Crescent has also facilitated a commercial convoy with key supplies and worked with the Syrian civil defense to transport vulnerable people, including those who wish to return to Asweda. But insecurity and road closures have disrupted commercial supply. Road access is still limited to 2 routes in, through Basra al-Sham and Bursa al-Kharir in Dara. Other routes, including the main highway from Damascus, remain closed. So, we need better humanitarian and commercial access, and most of all, we need safety. Aid convoys have come under fire this month. There have been attacks on health facilities, medics, ambulances. We continue working closely with the Syrian authorities and partners to strengthen channels for help. And I insist again, as I know that you will, on the protection and freedom of movement of civilians, humanitarian workers, and medical missions. Mr. President, my second point. Despite funding and security challenges, the UN and partners are delivering as much life-saving support as we can with the resources we have. In Syria, as elsewhere, as we implement the humanitarian reset, we are now implementing a hyper-prioritized plan, and we've restructured and streamlined our humanitarian coordination effort in country, including reducing senior roles. We are reaching almost 3.5 million people on average every month across Syria, from Latakia to Aleppo to Hasakeh. That is a noticeable increase from last year, despite less funding. Since December last year, we've scaled up across the humanitarian response. Nutrition for children under 5 who are stunted, subsidized bread to 2 million people every day. We're working with the authorities to rebuild critical services. The Ministry of Health with WHO and UNICEF are delivering a new national immunization strategy and rehabilitating hospitals and health facilities. Partners are rebuilding water stations, wells, laboratories, sewer networks. They continue to provide essential services in Al Hol camp and to support families leaving the camp. And UNHCR has been in discussions on assuming camp management activities. OCHA's country-based pool funds are now providing $75 million to support vulnerable people across the country. We've made some progress on NGO registration and visas for aid workers, but more is needed. I have agreed with the interim authorities the extension of cross-border operations from Turkey as we move towards importing more humanitarian supplies commercially. The Lebanese and Jordanian crossings are open and functioning well, with work towards 24-hour access. But, and this is of course my third point, without more funding, we won't be able to sustain these vital efforts, let alone expand them to more people who need them. The humanitarian appeal for 2025 is only 14% funded. Aid cuts are projected to lead to staffing cuts of at least 40% across the humanitarian community in Syria, with NGOs hit hardest. 16% of health facilities have suspended or reduced capacity due to the cuts. So, I want to thank all donors who have generously supported the humanitarian response, led at the moment by the EU, Germany, and Canada. And I want to call on all donors to keep supporting Syria and to disperse the generous pledges made at the Brussels conference back in March. Funding cuts are affecting our operations everywhere, of course. But among our 10 largest country appeals, it is the Syria appeal that's the lowest figure. And this is despite these hyper-prioritized plans having reduced the overall ask by nearly $1 billion compared to last year. With more resources, or even the funding that has been repeatedly promised, we can get critical medicine to 1 million more people each month. We can restore water services for an additional 5 million people. We can expand services for people returning to their home areas. We have also worked with partners and in consultation with the interim government to develop a plan to respond to the severe drought-like conditions that Syria is facing. As part of our broader appeal, for critical support for food, agriculture, clean water, and health services to 4.3 million people who are most affected. This is, I'm afraid, the worst drought in over 3 decades, and an ominous indicator of needs to come. Alongside funding, we also welcome the easing of sanctions by the US, EU, and UK, which opens up potential for vital investment and could reduce humanitarian needs. But the impact of that will take time. Complex legal environment that still continues for humanitarians continues to impede our work. Humanitarian carve-outs help, so I hope that we can extend those exemptions. Finally, Mr. President, while we surge humanitarian support, we need investment in longer-term support for development and reconstruction that will allow the people of Syria to reduce and ultimately end reliance on humanitarian aid. So I also strongly welcome the diplomatic progress made by Jordan, Turkey, the United States, France, countries from the region, and the Syrian authorities. This is a firm foundation for a much-needed shift from a humanitarian-led approach to a stronger development trajectory. The Syrian people do not want to depend on humanitarian help. So announcements of new investments in infrastructure and energy supply are encouraging, not just in their own right, but also as a signal of confidence from the region and beyond. The international community must help translate this momentum into tangible improvements in people's lives by delivering on those planned projects, by taking additional concrete steps on sanction relief and investing in infrastructure. Such initiatives and investments are essential as more than 2 million Syrian refugees and internally displaced people have returned home since December last year. Let me amplify again the call from my colleague Filippo Grandi, High Commissioner for Refugees, following his mission to Syria 2 months ago, where he asked for more support for those coming back. As he said, returns will prove short-lived without increased international support. Mr. President, the international community and this Council has been clear that we must shift the momentum away from the years of hardship and destruction towards recovery and hope. That means sustained commitment, patient diplomacy, and a relentless focus on delivery and implementation. The people of Syria do not need us to be commentators and problem observers. They need us to move with genuine urgency, generosity, and purpose. The humanitarian community has shown that we can deliver. With funding and access, we aim to no longer be needed. Please back us. So, my asks, political action to hold the peace in Asueda and prevent future escalations of this kind. Support for our funding and access requests, and to help us create the conditions, including through investment and sanctions lift, where the humanitarian mission can transition to genuine, Syrian-led recovery and rebuilding. We need to do that for the Syrian people, yes, but not just for Syria. This is a chance to demonstrate that international solidarity still matters and that coordinated international action still works. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al señor Fletcher.
I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen and Undersecretary General Fletcher, for your briefings. And I welcome the representative of the Syrian government who is with us today. Last week, the United States joined the members of this council in strongly condemning violence perpetrated against civilians in the Asueda Governorate since July, and calling on all parties to adhere to the ceasefire arrangement. We are also concerned by the more recent violence in Asueda and are closely watching recent clashes in Manjib and Deir ez-Zor, and urge all parties to maintain calm. We recall this Council's clear statement from March, calling on all parties to immediately cease all violence and emphasizing the need for the Syrian authorities to hold perpetrators of mass killings accountable. In that regard, We note the disturbing findings of the UN Syria Commission of Inquiry's latest report on violence against civilians since January, and we express our appreciation for the work of the commissioners. We welcome the Syrian government's actions to conduct comprehensive investigations and hold accountable all perpetrators of the recent violence, as well as its steps to increase the flow of aid, restore public services, and return displaced persons to their homes. We also welcome the Syrian government's pledge to fully cooperate with the UN to investigate crimes and to coordinate with the relevant UN agencies to support the flow of vital humanitarian aid. A united, representative Syria requires a consistent, transparent, and credible justice system. It is now on the Syrian government to take steps to arrest, detain, and pursue measures against those individuals who committed crimes and who are actively contributing to Syria's instability. Colleagues, the United States' support for Syria's sovereignty and territorial unity is unwavering. It is not our role to dictate the shape of Syria's government or constitution, but following the recent tragedies on the coast and in the south, two things should be clear. First, there is absolutely no place for sectarian violence. The Syrian government must act decisively and consistently to protect everyone, no matter their ethnicity or religion. There must be zero tolerance and swift justice for any member of Syria's military that abuses the trust placed in them. Second, every Syrian deserves to have a voice in how their country is governed. The Syrian people fought for more than 13 years, not just to rid themselves of Bashar al-Assad, but also for the right to decide their own fate. The only way Syria will stabilize is if all Syrians have a stake in the country's future and if they collectively share power. That is why we are urging the Syrian government and leaders across the country to engage in meaningful dialogue about their shared future. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're grateful to Special Envoy on Syria, Geir Pedersen, and USG on Humanitarian Affairs, Thomas Fletcher, for detailed reports on the situation in Syria. We have been following the situation very carefully in friendly Syria, and we truly feel for the Syrian people who have had to undergo so many trials. Our relationship is not based on any political context, but is based on tried and tested traditions of friendship and mutual respect, which was confirmed on the 31st of July with the visit of the Foreign Minister and Minister of Expatriates of Syria to Moscow. Unfortunately, the situation in Syria is far from stable. The country continues to confront challenges in almost every sphere, from the difficulties in establishing a new system of government to a very complex socioeconomic situation and a humanitarian crisis. We are convinced that the most urgent task in overcoming them is unification of the Syrian society and national reconciliation. Based on that, without exaggerating, the future of Syrian statehood will depend. That the statehood remains fragile, especially in the face of ethno-confessional challenges. This has been clearly demonstrated in the recent tragic events in Sueda. In addition to the March massacre of Alawites and the western coast of Syria, this incident raises serious concerns, both in terms of the scale of the violence and the number of victims. There are serious issues on the methods of use of force implemented on the ground in reacting to such situations. There are very alarming signals from ethno-confessional minorities in Syria that they continue to not feel secure, and they are fear persecution. They are confronting threats of violence and are forced to leave their regions where they reside en masse. For example, in Sueda, 200,000 people were forced to leave. If this situation does not change, it will become a significant constraint on the path towards national reconciliation and reestablishment of the social compact in Syria, and overall could undermine efforts to that end. Colleagues, all cases of violence based on ethno-confessional grounds require thorough and impartial investigation, holding perpetrators accountable. We look forward to the publication of the full report of the results of the Commission of Inquiry established to investigate the many cases of violence in the western coastal regions of Syria, and we hope to discuss them in the Council. We expect that the interim authorities in Syria will also react to the presidential statement of the Council from the 10th of August, calling for a reliable, immediate, transparent, impartial, and comprehensive investigation of the events in Sueda. This is important to strengthen the authority of the Damascus authorities and trust by the population of Syria. Impartial justice against any criminals and perpetrators, independently of their position and status, should help restore faith of the various ethnic and religious minorities that the new authorities are protecting the interests and security of all Syrians and not specific groups. Unfortunately, the level of terrorist threat remains high in Syria. The terrorist attack on the 22nd of June at the Prophet Elias Antiochian Orthodox Church in the east of Damascus, leading to over 20 fatalities and dozens of wounded, deserves the strongest condemnation. We call the Syrian authorities to step up efforts to combat the terrorist threat and ensure the necessary protection of Orthodox and overall all Christian shrines, and to bring all those responsible to justice. Mr. President, another very important task in the area of state building facing Damascus is the creation of sustainable state institutions. We note measures undertaken by the interim authorities, including the formation of a new government. However, the experience of the past few months has demonstrated also an acute need to conduct structural reforms of the Syrian army and law enforcement bodies in order to ensure that only professionals that are not stained by killing peaceful citizens and having no links to terrorist groups are included. It's important not to abandon career military people who have served the country loyally until December of 2024. Marginalizing them will only further the divide in Syrian society, will create the grounds for revanchism. Using the example of Iraq, we all know that the backbone of the strike forces of ISIS were the officers of Saddam's army who were seeking revenge against those who rejected them. The inclusiveness of the political process to which all members of the Security Council call for must take into account this aspect. There should be no deprivation of rights of any groups of the population, including those who served the state in Syria in the previous phase. The political process led and conducted by the Syrians, this is a basic principle enshrined in Resolution 2254, and it remains as relevant as ever. We expect that measures undertaken by the interim authorities will follow precisely that approach. And the parliamentary elections planned for September will be inclusive, and all ethnic and confessional groups and social groups will take an opportunity to take part in electing the new legislature. Very important in this context remains the reintegration of Kurds into the single Syrian state and the implementation of the agreements between the central authorities and the Euphrates region. Finally, stabilization in Syria and achieving internal tasks will depend to a large extent on external security. Today, the security continues to be undermined by the occupation by Israel of the Golan Heights, as well as the airstrikes by Israel against Syrian territory. We call on all states to strictly adhere to the provisions of Security Council Resolution 2254 about the respect for sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria, and all sides to to adhere to the disengagement of forces on the Golan Heights Agreement of 1964. The Security Council confirmed the principles of this in the aforementioned presidential statement and called on all states to refrain from internal affairs in the affairs of Syria. We hope that this appeal will be heeded. Now, moving on to the humanitarian situation. Unfortunately, as Tom Fletcher confirmed today, it continues to be complicated by instability and cascading economic and social problems. We call on the UN and its specialized agencies to continue to work actively to provide support to the population that has suffered from ethno and confessional violence in certain regions of Syria, and to restore infrastructure and ensure conditions for the peaceful return of citizens. We expect that the interim Syrian authorities will contribute to an unhindered work of humanitarian agencies and ensure the security of humanitarian workers. We're very, very concerned about the information provided by Tom Fletcher about attacks against humanitarian workers in the country. This is completely unacceptable. We support the initiative of the International Red Cross to deploy its presence in Sueda. This should contribute to stabilizing the situation and avoiding a repetition of violence. We hope that the Syrian authorities will provide support to the ICRC in achieving this goal. Lifting unilateral sanctions, which for many years prevented the development of the country, no doubt opens a window of opportunity. This is a movement in the right direction. You cannot refute the fact that unilateral sanctions for a long time prevented Syria from moving forward, and at the same time only harmed, in fact, the Syrian people rather than specific political leaders. However, to achieve sustainable results, comprehensive measures are necessary, geared towards the long term. As we see it, such measures should be accompanied not only by efforts of Syria itself, but sufficient international support. It's important to discuss comprehensive and long-term support aimed at restoring key areas of viable statehood. Syria requires not only assistance, but a format of cooperation that could lay the groundwork for future development of the country and allow it to ensure a decent livelihood for all its citizens. According to OCHA data, there's still a growing tendency of return of refugees and IDPs to their place of residence. This is a positive signal. At the same time, we believe it's very important that this process be conducted strictly on the basis of voluntary and informed choice by those who decide to return, while strictly complying with guarantees of security for them. Furthermore, we expect that the Syrian authorities, in cooperation with the specialized agencies of the UN, will continue to make efforts to do away with obstacles for those returning, including lack of basic services and lack of employment on the ground. This certainly complicates opportunities for people to start a new life. Mr. President, in conclusion, I'd like to underscore that Russia is a tried and tested friend of Syria, both at the bilateral and the global level. We are very happy to see similar signals from Syria in this new stage of their development. We're grateful to Syrian colleagues for steps that they're taking to ensure the security of Russian citizens and Russian facilities in Syria. We also value that Syria has not forgotten the role that the Soviet Union played in creating the basis of the Syrian economy, strengthening its military industry, and training its experts. We are ready to continue supporting the Syrian people in this post-conflict rebuilding. For us, it's important that Syria, having overcome the interim period challenges, becomes a strong, sustainable, and independent state where everyone, all Syrians, feel comfortable, independent of their ethno-confessional grounds. This should be the focus of the Syrian authorities and the entire international community. Thank you very much for your attention.
I would like to thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
I would also like to thank Special Envoy Peterson and USG Fletcher for their briefings this morning, and I welcome the representative from Syria to this meeting. Mr. President, allow me to make 3 points. First, There can be no meaningful political, humanitarian, or development progress in Syria without security. It is the foundation of all else. Denmark urges the parties to abide by the Soweto ceasefire arrangement. We also call on the SDF and transitional authorities to implement the March Agreement, supported by the US and France. We also note that terrorism continues to pose a serious threat. This was underscored only yesterday by the reported capture of senior Islamic State members during a raid in the northwest. In seeking to maintain the security required across Syria, we urge the transitional authorities to protect all Syrians, regardless of race or religion. All armed actors must comply with the obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Second, while we have seen stabilization in parts of Syria, the humanitarian consequences of 14 years of war remain severe, as also highlighted by our briefers today. Syria today hosts one of the largest humanitarian response operations in the world, of which Denmark is proud to remain a top donor, pledging around $95 million to the Syria crisis response this year. From Aleppo to Idlib, Homs and Al-Hasakah, fragile and deeply degraded towns and cities remain in urgent need of rehabilitation, reconstruction of housing, as well as general humanitarian and protection support. Denmark is especially concerned by the recent violence in Soweto and its humanitarian consequences. As we have heard today, while there has been some progress in maintaining humanitarian access into and throughout Soweto, there remains a pressing need for the greater protection of and access to the local population. Humanitarian staff and supplies in transit must also be guaranteed safety and unhindered access. Those who fled the violence must be able to safely return home. Local peacebuilding efforts will be crucial in reducing persistent intercommunal tensions and restoring calm. Denmark thanks all Council members for their constructive support over the past weeks in agreeing a presidential statement on this crisis. This statement not only highlighted the humanitarian and protection dimensions of the violence, but also sent an important signal on urgent need for credible and transparent investigations and accountability. We take note of the announcements made by the transitional authorities in this regard and believe it is urgent to take concrete measures to advance accountability, prevent further violence, and rebuild trust among affected communities. Mr. President, this brings me to my final point. It's critical for the Syrian people to have a sense of unity, protection, and the benefits of a political transition that brings a just and lasting peace. The future that Syrians want and deserve is one in which all people without distinction are afforded equal opportunities and where all voices are heard. This is particularly crucial as we look towards the election for the People's Assembly. We urge the transitional authorities to ensure that this is conducted transparently and with support from international elections observers. All Syrian communities must be represented in the new legislative body. The safe, secure, and open participation of all members of Syrian society in these elections will demonstrate whether the transitional authorities are truly committed to a new and inclusive Syria. In conclusion, Mr. President, the transformative change underway in Syria will be defined by the political actions taken in the weeks and months ahead. These actions will shape the prospects for rebuilding and re-engaging with the new Syria. The political, social, and security cohesion Syrians are striving for is built on respect, a just political and reconciliation process, and good faith engagement by all. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Special Envoy Pedersen as well as USG Fletcher for the detailed briefings, and I welcome the presence of the representative of Syria to this meeting. Mr. President, I wish to highlight the three following points today. First, Syria's volatile security landscape requires urgent action. The Council's presidential statement of August 10 strongly condemned the horrific violence in Soweto, including mass killings and the displacement of more than 185,000 people. The escalation of local sectarian clashes was followed by disturbing reports of serious violations, including by security forces affiliated to the interim authorities against Druze civilians. We were appalled by the shocking footage of medical staff being forced to kneel by armed men in military uniform inside a hospital in Sueda, with one reportedly executed. Following the fragile ceasefire and the announced withdrawal of security forces, we take note of the interim presidency's condemnation of abuses and its pledge of accountability. We expect this process to be credible, swift, transparent, impartial, and effective. Yet, the overall security situation remains precarious. The terrorist threat persists, with sporadic bombings, including the recent attack on the Mar Elias Orthodox Church in Damascus, and earlier sectarian violence along the Syrian coast. We understand that the Committee for Investigation and Fact-Finding into those events has submitted its report to the Syrian presidency. We expect its contents to be shared with this Council or made public to ensure justice for victims and accountability for perpetrators, irrespective of affiliation and in line with international laws and standards. We are further alarmed by the findings of the UN Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council, whose August 11 report points to violations amounting to potential war crimes committed by both pro-former government fighters and interim government forces. In light of this, we call on the interim authorities to ensure full accountability and justice so that all Syrians, regardless of ethnic, religious, or cultural background, can feel safe and protected. And this brings me to my second point. An inclusive political transition under Security Council Resolution 2254 is essential. The formation of a People's Assembly is a crucial step in Syria's political transition. We welcome the announcement of indirect parliamentary elections in September, provided all Syrians can participate as candidates and voters, including Christians, Alawites, Druze, Bedouin, and importantly, women. The recent sectarian violence has reinforced calls for a more democratic and inclusive Syria. Syria's new constitution must guarantee democracy, inclusivity, justice, and fair representation for all religious and ethnic groups and communities, as the current constitutional declaration remains insufficient. The September elections will be an important test in this regard, so as to enhance internal cohesion and increase international support to the efforts of the transitional government to promote stability and prosperity. Mr. President, as the Greek Foreign Minister repeated yesterday on the occasion of his constructive meeting with his Syrian counterpart in Athens, Greece reaffirms its commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria, urging all states to respect these principles. A Syria where Syrians will feel safe. The March 10 agreement between Damascus and the Syrian Democratic Forces in the northeast gives hope despite the challenges for its implementation. We call on all parties to act in a spirit of compromise and on regional actors to refrain from incitement or threats of intervention. Similarly, the integration of all armed groups into the national security and military forces, alongside a sustainable solution to the issue of foreign fighters, is indispensable for establishing stability and preventing radicalization. Extremist and terrorist elements can have no place in Syria's future. Mr. President, my third point. All this transpires against the backdrop of a truly precarious humanitarian situation, only aggravated by the climate crisis. As OCHA and Syrian civil society representatives have noted, 16.5 years and devastating wildfires, as a fellow Mediterranean country also facing the impacts of climate change, Greece expresses full solidarity with the Syrian people. We stress the need to reinforce the international humanitarian response, and Greece has decided to engage with the interim Syrian authorities to assist Syria with expertise and best practices transfer in building its capacities on civil protection and against natural disasters. Equally, Greece is ready to support any efforts for an inclusive and representative political system and to promote stability and integration in the Eastern Mediterranean region. In the same spirit, the European Union swiftly lifted sanctions under a gradual, conditional, and reversible approach to support Syria. This policy will continue to be guided by progress on accountability, inclusivity, and respect for international law, including the international law of the sea. In conclusion, Mr. President, Greece reiterates its support and solidarity with the Syrian people as they strive to turn the page from a dark chapter towards a brighter future. This can only be achieved through a genuinely inclusive political transition with credible accountability and security for all. We will continue to support the UN and the Office of the Special Envoy in their efforts to achieve these goals. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3+, namely Guyana, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and my own country, Algeria. At the outset, the A3+ extends its sincere appreciation to Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and their Secretary General Tom Fletcher for their briefings. We also appreciate the participation at this debate of His Excellency Qusay al-Dahak, the permanent representative of Syria, and also the participation of representatives of Iran, Qatar, and Turkey. Mr. President, the A3+ remains gravely concerned about the overall situation in Syria, which continues to be marked by fragility and volatility. After more than a decade of conflict, the Syrian people still face violence, insecurity, and humanitarian deprivation on an unbearable scale. We take note with deep concern of the recent report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, which documented grave violations against civilians in the coastal region earlier this year. These horrific findings remind us of the urgency of ensuring justice and accountability. Perpetrators of such crimes must not be allowed to act with impunity. Equally alarming are the recent events in Sueda, with heavy tolls and more than 192 people displaced. The A3+ underscores the urgent need for all parties to adhere to the ceasefire arrangement, to protect civilians, and to guarantee immediate and unhindering humanitarian access to all affected areas in Sueda and throughout Syria. Failure to do so will only deepen the suffering of the Syrian people, hinder recovery efforts, and fuel further instability in the country. We also warn against the danger of this tragic pattern of violence spreading to other regions in Syria. Renewed conflict risks undoing the limited progress achieved so far and undermining the possibility of building a durable peace. In this regard, we call for the full implementation of the March Agreement with the Syrian Democratic Forces, an agreement which represents an important step toward de-escalation and national reconciliation. Only through dialogue, Syrians can overcome their divergences. In this regard, the upcoming legislative elections represent an important opportunity to advance toward inclusive governance. They must be conducted transparently and fairly to strengthen legitimacy and trust. This legislative election process must allow to the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and youth. President, we must be clear in rejecting external interference that exacerbates instability in Syria. The A3+ reiterates its strong condemnation of Israel's repeated military action in Syria. Such actions flagrantly violate Syria's sovereignty. The 1974 disengagement agreement, international law, and the UN Charter, ultimately. They only serve to aggravate tensions and further destabilize the region. The A3+ reaffirms its unwavering support for Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity. And we reiterate our full support for the efforts of the UN Special Envoy and for a Syrian-owned, Syrian-led political process as the only sustainable path toward peace. We also stress the critical role of the United Nations in this process. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Syria is further exacerbated by the worst drought in decades, with wheat production collapsing by 40%. The A3+ takes note that over 2.3 million Syrians have returned to their area of origin. While encouraging, these returns takes place amid severe gaps, which must be addressed if they are to be sustainable. Today, more than half of the population suffers from food insecurity, and nearly 3 million people are at risk of severe hunger. Yet, the humanitarian response is faltering. Insecurity, logistical barriers, and chronic underfunding severely constrain aid delivery. The 2025 Humanitarian Response Plan, which appeals for $3.2 billion, is only 14% funded. This is an alarming shortfall, and the A3+ calls on all donors to urgently mobilize resources to ensure that life-saving assistance reaches those most in need before the crisis spirals further out of control. Explosive remnants of war and landmines continue to cause injuries and death of many persons, particularly among children. We urge increased support, including funding and capacity building to address mines threat. Mr. President, to conclude, the A3+ firmly believe that the future of Syria must be built on three inseparable pillars: accountability for past crimes, inclusivity in the political process, and respect for sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de...
I thank the delegation of Algeria. I give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Special Envoy Pedersen and USG Fletcher for their briefings. This month, Syria witnessed its imminent security threats significantly abated as a result of the ceasefire among the parties. However, the uncertain political landscape continues to cloud its horizon for a successful and inclusive transition. Let me highlight the following 3 points. First, we call on all parties of the March Agreement to prioritize building a unified Syria and implement the terms without delay. Since the agreement was reached between Damascus and SDF in March, little implementation progress has been made. While sporadic military clashes along Deir ez-Zor has raised the concerns of the international community over a potential military escalation. The bilateral talks that resumed earlier this month also resulted in few outcomes, dampening the prospect of the agreement being fully implemented by the end of this year, as originally planned. Both Damascus and the international community cannot afford another divided Syria. As shown repeatedly early this year, fragmented Syria is subject to turmoil and even risks illegitimate foreign intervention and occupation. We therefore urge all parties to actively engage with each other to finalize the details in implementing the March Agreement in a prompt manner. Any further delay will jeopardize not only the successful implementation of the general election to be held in September, but also the already fragile domestic security scarred by persistent sectarian violence, which brings to my second point. Second, we urge the transitional government to fully implement the recommendation in COI report regarding the coastal violence. The recently released COI report reveals appalling snapshots of the incidents, finding that the violence featured widespread and systematic attacks against civilians. It is equally disturbing that violence involved members of certain factions of the security forces of the transitional government, which was not mentioned in the fact-finding committee's announcement of its own finding last month. As pointed out in the report, it is imperative that Damascus prioritize preventing any further recurrence of sectarian violence in its political transition. Sectarian-based atrocity risks repeating itself without a clear picture on how perpetrators will be held accountable. Therefore, we reiterate our call that those responsible entities should be clearly named in the ensuing prosecutions. Third, we urge the international community to increase funding to address the continuing humanitarian crisis in the country. Restoring stability in Syria faces the risks of stagnation as the country grapples with deteriorating humanitarian conditions, marked by the worst drought in decades and the instability in southern Syria. They are also aggravated by a severe and continued funding shortfall, which hit only 13% of the humanitarian response's priorities this year. We hope the international community will step up its support, building on international efforts already underway, including our contributions of $35 million this year, focusing on early recovery and resilience of the conflict-affected populations. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco a la...
I thank the Republic of Korea for your statement, and I now give the floor to Slovenia.
And thank you, Special Envoy Peterson and USG Fletcher, for your briefings. Mr. President, a path to peaceful Syria, both domestically and with its neighbors, remains fragile. At home, we reiterate the importance of an inclusive, transparent, and credible political transition towards democratic, strong, and reliable state institutions. We underscore the need to advance efforts aiming at promoting stability, achieving transitional justice, and foster genuine national reconciliation. In international relations, we hope Syria will continue to build peaceful relations with its neighbors and the wider region. We encourage the interim authorities to uphold these principles throughout the process. Today, I wish to make the following points. First and foremost, we urgently call for an immediate end to violence across Syria. Reports of crimes, including executions, arbitrary killings, kidnappings, looting, and the destruction of property, are deeply alarming. Of particular concern are reports of abductions, trafficking, and sexual exploitation of women and girls, especially those from Druze and Alawite communities. We are also deeply troubled by emerging patterns of the abuse of women, including abuses perpetrated by armed combatants. This must stop immediately. Syrian interim authorities must assert full control over the security forces and ensure accountability for all perpetrators, regardless of affiliation or rank, in line with international law, standards, and the Constitutional Declaration. Syrians need to see that the state and its security forces exist solely to protect and serve them. In this context, the security sector reform must advance in parallel with tangible measures that guarantee the protection and safety of all civilians. This is essential to restoring trust, ensuring security, promoting the rule of law, and fostering national unity. Second, the recent violence outbreaks underscore the critical importance of building a future for Syria that is truly inclusive, as lasting peace and security depend on a genuine inclusion. We urge the Syrian interim authorities to make this a priority in the political transition. Every Syrian deserves a voice in shaping its country's future. The establishment of People's Assembly as the interim legislative is a key opportunity to build a stable political system
based on pluralism and accountability. For the transition to succeed, the commitments in the constitutional declaration must be fully respected. Equally important is the full inclusion of all major Syrian groups as voters and candidates, with women's full, equal, safe and meaningful participation playing a fundamental role. Ensuring meaningful inclusion, especially in conflict-affected areas, remains a significant challenge and must be addressed as a priority. Third, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains very serious. We urgently call for full, regular and unrestricted access for all aid organizations to help those in need. The international community must support the Syrian people in addressing their urgent needs in rebuilding their country. The United Nations, especially Envoy Pedersen, has a vital role in this effort and in advancing an inclusive political process in line with the principles of the Resolution 2254. Let me end the statement by reaffirming our support for Syria's sovereignty, unity and territorial integrity, and call on Israel to respect the demilitarized zone and the 1974 disengagement agreement. Mr. President, we are ready to work with Syria, with this Council, and the wider international community in support of a more peaceful, prosperous, and stable future, one that the Syrian people rightfully deserve. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de Eslovenia su declaración. Doy la palabra a la...
Thank you. The next speaker is Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and Undersecretary General Tom Fletcher for their briefings. Their updates highlight the immense challenges that Syria faces today after more than a decade of conflict. We welcome the presence of the representatives of Syria, Iran, Turkey, and Qatar. Mr. President, we recognize the efforts of the Syrian authorities and people in pursuing dialogue, national cooperation, and regional outreach, which, though fragile, represent an important step towards peace and recovery. These developments, together with the prospect of elections later this year, offer a ray of hope to a nation that has endured immense suffering. This progress, however, remains fragile, challenged by ongoing clashes, external interference, and a worsening humanitarian crisis. The foremost priority must be to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people. Over 16 million Syrians remain in need of humanitarian assistance. Children continue to face hunger and malnutrition on a staggering scale. Access to safe water, healthcare, and education is collapsing. Despite these dire needs, humanitarian appeals remain underfunded. Urgent action is required to ensure adequate resources for the UN's response plan to meet the humanitarian needs. Taking heed of USG Fletcher's call, the international community must also move beyond humanitarian action towards supporting Syria's sustainable development. At the same time, the political track remains indispensable. We welcome the progress vis-à-vis political transition, including the commitment to hold parliamentary elections in September. The credibility of this process will depend on inclusivity. All political and social groups must have a genuine stake if the process is to reflect the aspirations of the Syrian people. The principles under Resolution 2254 must be adhered to. The situation in Soweida, the western coast, and the northeast is a matter of concern. Any attempts to manipulate or patronize local communities risk deepening divisions and constitute unwarranted external interference. We condemn all violence against civilians and tragic loss of lives and call for accountability of those responsible. What Syria requires is genuine political support and international assistance in this complex environment, rather than the creation of new fault lines or foreign intervention. Mr. President, on the security front, the threat of terrorism persists. The presence of foreign terrorist fighters, such as from ETIM, and groups known to have terrorist affiliation, including Daesh, continue to pose a threat to security of Syria and the region. According to the latest report of the Secretary General on threat posed by Daesh to international peace and security, The situation in Syria remains fragile. Since the fall of the previous government, Daesh has been intent on destabilizing the interim authorities and exploiting existing vulnerabilities. Daesh members seized stockpiles of heavy weaponry, and over 500 detainees affiliated with Daesh were released from detention facilities. A comprehensive counterterrorism strategy centered on prevention, disarmament, rehabilitation, and reintegration is essential to secure long-term stability. Mr. President, we strongly condemn the repeated Israeli violations of Syria's sovereignty, including in Sowaida, Daraa, Damascus, and the occupied Syrian Golan. These acts are blatant violations of international law, the UN Charter, and Security Council resolutions, threatening regional peace as well as obstructing Syria's path to recovery. Security Council resolutions, including 350, 497, and the 1974 disengagement agreement, must be fully respected. Syria's road to peace and stability demands sustained international solidarity, respect for its sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, and tangible support to address humanitarian and economic challenges. Pakistan stands in full solidarity with the Syrian people. We will continue to support all efforts for a sovereign, unified, inclusive, peaceful, and prosperous Syria. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de Pakistán.
I thank Pakistan, and I now give the floor to China.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Envoy Patterson and USG Fletcher for their briefings. I welcome the presence of the representatives of Syria, Iran, Turkey, and Qatar at today's meeting. At present, the situation in Syria is still at a critical stage. Helping Syria to achieve a smooth political transition and a return to peace and stability at an early date is a common expectation of the international community and should be the goal of joint efforts by all parties. I would like to make the following points. First, China supports the Syrian interim authorities in continuing to engage in extensive dialogue and communication with all parties concerned in accordance with the principles set out in Council Resolution 2254 in order to promote an inclusive political transition process. We note that the Syrian interim authorities have enacted a decree on the interim People's Assembly elections and are expected to complete parliamentary elections by mid-September. China supports Special Envoy Patterson in playing his role in the political transition process in Syria. Second, the security situation in Syria is still fragile, with armed conflicts occurring from time to time. Just recently, recurring large-scale violence happened on the western coast of Syria and in Sowaida. A large number of innocent civilians were tragically abused and killed, which is saddening. It is the responsibility of the Syrian interim authorities to protect the legitimate rights and interests of all Syrians. Investigation reports on the violence in the western coast areas should be made public at an early date, and there should be investigation and accountability of the violent incidents in Sowaida in a transparent, credible, and responsible manner. All parties in Syria should work in the same direction to jointly maintain stability and avoid triggering a new conflict. Third, terrorist forces are increasingly active within Syria, which is worrying. There are reports that indicate that foreign terrorist fighters were major perpetrators of the violent incidents on the western coast in March and in Sowaida in July. Continued condoning of terrorists will only bring greater harm to Syria and other countries in the region. We urge the Syrian interim authorities to take strong measures to resolutely counter all Council-listed terrorist organizations, including the ETIM, also known as Turkestan Islamic Party. It must be pointed out that the purpose of the Council's sanctions on Syria is to counter the terrorist forces within Syria and to maintain peace and security in the country and the region. With regard to adjusting its sanctions regime on Syria, the Council should consider the current counterterrorism and security situation in Syria, the capacity of the Syrian interim authorities, and the possible impacts of such adjustments, among others, in a comprehensive manner, and should make judicious decisions based on a careful study in order to strictly prevent the terrorist forces in Syria from exploiting the situation and gaining strength. Fourth, UN humanitarian agencies have made great efforts to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Syria, in particular by overcoming difficulties and actively coordinating the delivery of humanitarian supplies into Soweto. China calls on the international community to increase its humanitarian assistance to Syria and help the Syrian people to tide over these difficult times. China is concerned about reports of attacks on humanitarian convoys in Daraa Governorate. The safety and security of humanitarian workers should be guaranteed under all circumstances. Lastly, I would like to reiterate that the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Syria should be fully respected. This is a principle that must be upheld in dealing with the Syrian issue. The Israeli occupation of the Golan is completely null and void. Unauthorized foreign troops should not be stationed in the area of separation. The discharging of UNDOP's duties in accordance with its mandate given by the Council should be guaranteed. Thank you, President.
Agradezco.
I thank China for your statement. And I now give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Under-Secretary General Fletcher for briefing us today. I welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Syria and other countries from the region. I will make 3 points. First, as we mark this week World Humanitarian Day, I wanted to pay tribute to the tireless work of humanitarian actors to deliver assistance to those who need it most in Syria. As we heard from USG Fletcher, humanitarian needs in Syria remain immense, exacerbated by outbreaks of violence as well as natural disasters. In southern Syria, though we welcome the ceasefire, we remain concerned by the continued difficulty of humanitarian and commercial access to the region. Access is vital to ensure aid can reach those who desperately need it. We welcome those who are scaling up their response. Earlier this month, the UK announced a further package of support of over $2.2 million to provide urgently needed healthcare, medicines, food, and clean water to those displaced by the recent violence. Second, we welcome the release of the UN's Independent Commission of Inquiry report on the events in the coastal region in March. We recognise the access granted to the Commission by the Syrian government. And we urge the Syrian government to move swiftly to implement the recommendations of this report, pursue accountability for those responsible, regardless of affiliation, and to continue to prioritise justice for all Syrians, including those impacted by violence last month. Third, President, we welcome the Syrian government's steps towards political transition, including the planned People's Assembly elections and consultations that have taken place across Syria with the Supreme Council. Transparency and inclusion are essential for a lasting political transition that secures the support and confidence of the Syrian people. We welcome the work the UN is doing with the Syrian government on the forthcoming elections. The UN has a clear role to play in supporting the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned transition. The UK looks forward to discussing the conclusions of the UN's strategic assessment on Syria to ensure this Council and the UN are best able to assist the Syrian people as they rebuild. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of the UK for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France. Thank you, President. I would like to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and USG Fletcher for their briefings. Today, Syria is at a crossroads. After decades of dictatorship and war, an inclusive, peaceful Syria is possible. This transition nevertheless remains fragile, and the international community must help the Syrian authorities to banish the demons of the past. 4 areas are key in this regard. First of all, there is an urgent need to restore civil peace. Violence in the region of Soeda in mid-July echoed the abuses in the coastal region at the start of March. In the last case, the recent report of the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry clearly shows that there were shared responsibilities between different groups and underscores the importance of better oversight of members of the government forces. The Syrian authorities must therefore implement this report's recommendations, as they have committed to do, by bringing to justice all perpetrators of this violence and by working to achieve reconciliation between communities. It is their responsibility to show that they are able to ensure the protection of all Syrians. In the northeast of the country, France intends to continue its facilitation efforts while respecting Syria's unity and sovereignty, working with the United States. The goal here is to implement the agreements of the 10th of March 2025 between representatives of the northeast and Damascus in a spirit of responsibility and respect for everyone's rights. Ultimately, there can be no return to civil peace unless there is a transitional justice process in place. The Syrian authorities must address this matter with the support of the international community, the relevant UN institutions and civil society organizations who are working in this area. France encourages the Syrian authorities to cooperate with their partners, and we are willing to participate in strengthening the Syrian justice system's capacity, which will allow the work of the National Authority for Transitional Justice to accelerate. Secondly, the counter-terrorism efforts must also continue. The 23rd of June attack on the Mar Elias Church recalled the persistent nature of the terrorist threat in Syria. The Syrian authorities need to undertake commitments and all measures to counter this threat. France is willing to provide its support. At the same time, the issue of foreign terrorist fighters must also be addressed. Thirdly, institutions for all Syrians must be built to contribute to the country's reconstruction. Efforts to relaunch the Syrian economy are critical to move in time from a humanitarian approach to an approach that supports Syria's development and reconstruction. The lifting of European, British and American sanctions was a decisive step forward. The recovery of the Syrian economy must make it possible for Syrians' trust in the future of their country to be rebuilt. In the short term, humanitarian aid remains critical as millions of Syrians are still in need. This must be delivered without hindrance and in full security wherever it is needed. It is notably the case in Soeda, where security and basic services must be re-established to allow those displaced to return to their homes. Syria's reconstruction also involves the establishment of institutions in which all Syrians feel represented, in the spirit of Resolution 2254. Positive developments have been achieved since the formation of the transitional government in March. The Syrian authorities must now move towards the appointment of a provisional legislative assembly. This is critical to adopt the reforms that the country needs. At each stage, the involvement of all Syrians must guide the implementation of the transition, and the efforts of Geir Pedersen in this regard are critical, and we fully support his work. Finally, Syria's neighbors must do their bit and help Syria achieve stability. We welcome the renewal of cordial relations between Syria and several countries in its neighborhood. We reiterate our belief that Damascus's engagement with Israel is an opportunity. Israel must end its military activities on Syrian territory and withdraw from the zone of separation established pursuant to the 1974 disengagement agreement. On the basis of this agreement, Syria and Israel must identify an arrangement which bears both sides' security concerns in mind. France supports the ongoing dialogue between the Israeli and Syrian authorities. They met this week in Paris under US mediation. President, building a new Syria is an opportunity that the Syrian authorities and the international community must seize. Of all the priorities that have been mentioned, we hope that the Secretariat Strategic Review will help better organize the work of the UN in Syria. Upon this understanding, the Council should also help support the current transition. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Panama. Your Excellencies, we would also like to thank Mr. Pedersen and Mr. Fletcher for their briefings. Panama remains concerned about persistent violence and the internal fragmentation that continues to affect civilians in Syria. We, of course, are concerned to see that the lack of political will of the parties, together with the prolonged suffering of the people, only deepens despair and divisions. We believe that peace can only be built on the basis of an inclusive political process that highlights the importance of respecting Syrian sovereignty and which revitalizes the relevance of the UN Charter and the mandate of Resolution 2254, which must be implemented bearing in mind the current context. On the 8th of August, a convoy of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent was attacked in Daraa. In spite of these challenges, 4 convoys supported by the UN were able to deliver vital assistance to Soweida. This effort shows the perseverance and commitment of humanitarian personnel working in spite of adverse conditions. These are values to which Panama always pays tribute in its statements in this Council. Unhindered humanitarian aid is non-negotiable under any circumstances. It's also alarming that, according to UNICEF's recent statistics, hostilities in the south of the country have led to the death of at least 22 children and have left another 21 children injured. This human tragedy rends the already fragile social fabric in Syria. It perpetuates the cycle of violence and makes clear our moral responsibility to step up efforts to protect children in conflicts. It is also critical to address the residual threats from the conflicts to ensure that the displaced can carry out a safe, dignified, voluntary return to the communities that had been affected. Another persistent element in the situation in Syria is the presence of non-state armed actors and the persistence of terrorist cells such as Daesh, which continue to undermine national and regional stability. Only yesterday in this Council we heard briefings about the increasing adaptability and territorial gains of terrorist groups who are using emerging technologies. That is why we stress the need to build unified professional security institutions that are subject to the rule of law to avoid images such as those that we saw a few weeks ago in Al-Suwaydra and Daraa. We also think that we need to see an independent judiciary built up to ensure accountability for the crimes that have been committed and to avoid any recurrence of these abuses that only slow down the progress that has been made for the Syrian people who have already suffered enough. Against this backdrop, colleagues, we should recognize the positive developments, the announcement of parliamentary elections, particularly the open invitation to international observers and the progressive increased involvement of women to make up at least 20% of the electorate in the committees. These are signs, positive signs, that political will can move Syria towards a unified, autonomous future. Lastly, I would just like to venture to say the following. Unfortunately, the circumstances that deteriorated institutions and hindered governance in Syria, as well as the democratic processes and the possibilities that ultimately led to the lack of stability in Syria for too long, have meant that there were serious vacuums in Syria. Unfortunately, any transitional government needs to ensure the re-establishment of robust institutions, security, trust, inclusive electoral processes, which are also transparent, with results that are respected, with sufficient legal basis, as well as an independent, effective judiciary and economic recovery and social development. These are all necessary to meet the expectations of the Syrian people and to alleviate the humanitarian crisis. But this requires a lot of time. The international community and all of us are legitimately calling for criminal responsibility for those who carried out intolerable violations against civilians. This cannot be satisfied unless there is respect for international law, and this also means that there must be a minimum judicial system that supports judicial investigations and procedures. And this is something that also requires some time. Bitter enemies have to ultimately work together in order to build a shared future and to contribute to the country's future development. That is why there is an urgent need for significant international support and also patience at the same time. Dear colleagues, a few days ago we adopted a presidential statement which expressed deep concern about the violence in Sueda. It also underscored the need to respect the ceasefire and international humanitarian law. This same spirit of collaboration which we showed when we built consensus is the most valuable example that we can provide to the Syrians as well. It is evidence that dialogue and cooperation are the most effective tools for them to rebuild their lives and the life of their nation under the leadership of Syrians themselves. Thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council.
Doy la palabra.
I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
I thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to congratulate you and your team for your presidency of the Security Council in the current month, and I would like to thank your predecessor, the Permanent Representative of Pakistan, and his team for the successful presidency of the Council last month. I would also like to thank Mr. Geir Peterson, the Special Envoy to Syria, and Mr. Tom Fletcher, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, for their briefings and for the work that they and their teams are doing. Mr. President, the government of Syria continues its efforts to restore peace and security and improve the living and humanitarian conditions of Syrians throughout the country. We are working on addressing the intersecting challenges that are facing our people after long years of a war that has exhausted and weakened the Syrian people and destroyed the country's infrastructure and economy and left behind a painful suffering that has affected all Syrians. The last period has witnessed the adoption of practical measures on the road to recovery and the establishment of foundations to build promising economic partnerships to invigorate the economy and to rebuild and to push forth towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Syria looks forward to its positive international engagement and to receiving further support for it and for its people at this sensitive stage. National efforts continue to face a group of complex challenges that negatively affect Syrian reality, at the forefront of which are the aggressive Israeli policies that violate Syria's sovereignty and that carry out incursions into its lands and perpetrate violations against its people, and its quest to weaken the Syrian state and affect its national unity by attacking it outright and by setting the fires of discourse and fanning the flames of existing tensions. All of this aims to establish a new fait accompli of occupation that is in line with the expansionist schemes of the occupation, which are a blatant and dangerous violation of international law and the basis of stable international relations and a direct threat to the sovereignty of countries and to regional and international peace and security here. Syria renews its call upon the Security Council to condemn the Israeli attacks and to oblige the Israeli occupation authorities to withdraw their forces from the Syrian territories that it has been present in over the past few months, and to end its occupation of the Syrian Golan in accordance with relevant United Nations resolutions, at the forefront of which are resolutions 242, 338, and 497. We regret that the presidential statement adopted by the Security Council on the 10th of August, we regret that it contained no condemnation of the recent Israeli attacks on the surroundings of the presidential palace, as well as the Chief of Staff's headquarters in Damascus. Mr. President, in light of the report issued by the International Independent Commission of Inquiry on the painful events that took place on the Syrian coast, the Foreign Minister sent an official letter to the chairman of the committee, and he expressed his appreciation for the efforts made and the points that are in line with the conclusions arrived at by the Independent National Committee formed for that purpose. The Foreign Minister has renewed the Syrian government's commitment to transparency and accountability and constructive cooperation with the international community. And this was manifest in the unprecedented permission given to the fact-finding integrity to the investigative team to have unimpeded access to the areas affected by violence and to deal seriously with alleged violations through conducting investigations and detaining several persons. The Foreign Minister also confirmed the government's intention to build national institutions based on justice and the rule of law. The Minister welcomed the conclusions arrived at by the Commission on the absence of any government policy to perpetrate these crimes. Rather, it noted that orders were issued to prevent them and to return order. He also noted that the recommendations by the Commission, in addition to the recommendations made by the National Commission, will form a roadmap to enhance justice and to continue progress in Syria despite the challenges. He confirmed that Syria will continue to cooperate with the Commission and the international community on the basis of full respect for Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. In the same vein, the Foreign Minister reaffirmed that As-Suwaida, with its national and historic symbolism, and the people of Suwaida are a true part of Syria's national makeup and cannot be excluded or marginalized, and protecting them continues to be the primary responsibility of the country and of the state, and has always been so. What the governorate witnessed in terms of bloody, painful, and heinous incidents was a result of Israeli attempts to light the fires of sectarian strife and to destabilize the country. Today, we continue our efforts to establish civil peace and return stability and to enhance the delivery of humanitarian aid to all those who need it in cooperation with United Nations agencies and humanitarian partners. Many humanitarian aid convoys have been dispatched in coordination with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, and they headed to Daraa and As-Suwaida. Moreover, we have facilitated visits by international delegations to these areas in order to evaluate needs and work on meeting them. These efforts have also been manifest in several other forms, including the meeting between Syria, Jordan, and the United States, hosted by the sisterly kingdom of Jordan, and we thank them for hosting it, to discuss the situation in Syria and means of supporting reconstruction on the foundations that would guarantee Syria's security and stability, its sovereignty, its unity, and in a manner that would meet the aspirations of Syria's people. Those at the meeting stressed the need to give precedence to logic and dialogue and to reject any destructive external interference. They welcomed the government's commitment to conduct full investigations and to hold accountable those who perpetrated crimes and violations in As-Suwaida. And they welcomed the government's readiness to cooperate with relevant United Nations agencies in a manner that would enhance justice and would guarantee reparation for the victims. The Syrian government reiterates its absolute rejection of any attempt to break up Syria or to take advantage of any events to establish and to implement any destructive foreign agendas. We reject any unilateral measures that do not contribute to healing the rift or achieving national reconciliation and which are not in line with the country's sovereignty or territorial integrity and unity. The government of Syria stresses that the door to a Syrian national dialogue will continue to be open to all those who seek a genuine dialogue and joint action that aims to take Syria to a better future that is worthy of all its people with no exception. Mr. President, Syrians still look to the international community to offer support in the humanitarian and developmental fields, and in a manner that would achieve their aspirations in creating a qualitative shift in their living standards and in alleviating their suffering and the severe lack of basic services. They seek this aid to address the serious challenges resulting from climate change, including the fires that once again burn throughout the country, and the catastrophic drought that has deprived Syrians of their basic water needs and which seriously threatens agricultural output and food security. We have heard and we have listened to the statements made by the USG and several delegates on the impact of the drought as well as the declining agricultural productivity and what this means in terms of food security among the Syrians. Overcoming these challenges requires enhancing cooperation and solidarity with Syria and supporting the different vital sectors as well as humanitarian action and developmental work. It requires meeting the pledges made to fund the humanitarian response plan. And as we heard, the funding rate has not exceeded, and we were approaching the last quarter of the year, it has not exceeded 14%. This means that we renew our call to support Syria and to meet the announced pledges to fund the humanitarian response plan and to lift the remaining coercive measures and to close the sanctions file once and for all. And here we note the need to support the United States draft resolution due to be submitted to the Security Council to complete the measures, the delisting procedures from the sanction lists. My country, Syria, stresses its commitment to partnerships and continued cooperation with the United Nations and its specialized agencies. We have reviewed some of the contents of the strategic evaluation of the United Nations role in Syria. And here we stress that we continue to cooperate with the Office of the Special Envoy, Peterson, and the agencies of the organization. And we note the urgent need for the United Nations teams in Syria, and especially the incoming resident coordinator, the need for them to work in a more coherent, coordinated, and effective manner, as partial interventions and parallel evaluations and duplicate efforts reflect negatively on the efficacy of humanitarian operations and limit their output and outcomes. Mr. President, Syrians have always been and will always rise above any attempt to plant the seeds of discord or division. And today, Syrians are deeply committed to their national belonging, and they look towards turning over this leaf of pain and suffering so that they can build a future for their country. Syria, despite the trials and tribulations, will remain united with its people and proud of its diversity and committed to its sovereignty. It will chart a path towards a bright future that is built by all Syrians and for all Syrians, women and men, and young men and young women. In closing, Mr. President, and seeing as this is the last statement I will be delivering on behalf of my country before your August Council, I would like to address you all with my sincere thanks and appreciation. I thank the permanent representatives and the members of their teams and delegations. I thank all member states and the Secretariat and its team. And I thank the interpreters. I thank them for their coordination and for cooperation, a relationship that we've enjoyed over the past year and a half that I've spent among you as a permanent representative of Syria at the United Nations. And in very complex conditions, sensitive ones that had many challenges and greater hopes. I have always, myself and my team, whom I thank sincerely, we have continued to strive to perform our diplomatic duties professionally and with integrity to convey the positions of the Syrian government and to defend it in all international fora. Our compass and our main message has always been and will continue to be and will remain that of support for the Syrian people and alleviating their suffering and lifting the sanctions and supporting humanitarian work and development. I thank our partners that I have been honored to work with throughout my long years in the field of humanitarian and development work. I call upon you to continue supporting Syria and the Syrian people. The Syrians rely on this continued positive international engagement and the constructive support for their efforts. They look forward to turning over this painful leaf, this extremely painful leaf of war and suffering. I call for the blessings for all the martyrs of Syria. I call and I pray for patience and strength to their families. And I would like to congratulate Ambassador Brahim Al-Alabi, who will assume his responsibilities as my successor, and I wish him success in all his efforts to serve Syria and the Syrians. I leave this forum and I fully believe that Syria, with its great history and its civilization and its people and their national belonging will overcome all difficulties and all challenges, and it will be a single unified homeland where everyone will work together to build a better future made by all Syrians and for all Syrians.
For all Syrians. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank you, sir.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the delegation of the Syrian Arab Republic. I now give the floor to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, thank you, Mr. President. Since this is my first intervention this month, allow me to extend my congratulations to you, Mr. President, on Panama's assumption of the presidency of Security Council for this month. We are confident that under your able guidance, the Council work will be steered successfully. I also wish to commend Pakistan for its effective stewardship and valuable contributions during its presidency in July. We thank Special Envoy Mr. Peterson and Under Secretary Mr. Fletcher for their informative and insightful briefing. On the situation in Syria, I wish to make the following points. First, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains dire. We commend OCHA, UN agencies, and humanitarian partners for delivering life-saving assistance under difficult circumstances. We reiterate the call by the Security Council for full, safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to all affected communities in strict accordance with the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. In this context, we welcome lifting all illegal unilateral coercive measures imposed on Syrian people. These illegal measures deepen the humanitarian crisis, block reconstruction, and obstruct economic recovery. Their removal is essential to enable the safe and dignified return of refugees and internally displaced persons. Sanctions must never be used as an instrument of political coercion or interference in Syrian internal affairs. Second, we take note the recent report of the monitoring team of the Sanctions Committee 1267, which highlights the persistent and grave threat of terrorism in Syria. Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and FTFs continue to destabilize Syria and the wider region. Seriously, deeply alarmed by credible reports indicating the relocation of certain terrorist elements and FTFs from Syria to Afghanistan, which pose a direct threat to Afghanistan neighbors and regional stability. We stress that all states must fully comply with international law in combating terrorism in all its forms and manifestation. Third, the situation in Sueda remains fragile. According to the report, while a ceasefire has restored temporarily calm, clash continue, and the risk of renewed violence is high without durable arrangement. The humanitarian impact, including the displacement of nearly 200,000 civilians and restricted access, is deeply alarming. We recall the Council's presidential statement of 10th August, which condemned these atrocities and called for the protection of all Syrians. We welcome the Syrian interim authorities' condemnation and pledge to investigate, but stress that accountability must be swift, credible, transparent, and impartial, including for atrocities against the Alawite communities in Latakia and Tartus. We urge the authorities to ensure all perpetrators are brought to justice. Fourth, we remain concerned about the clash between Syrian democratic forces and the interim authorities in the northeast. We stress that the ongoing political engagement between the parties must be actively encouraged and expanded to prevent further escalation and to create meaningful avenue for dialogue. Fifth, the Security Council should not ignore the ongoing destabilizing action of the Israeli regime in Syria. Israel's repeated aggressive attacks have caused civilian casualties, destroyed vital infrastructure, and escalated regional tensions. We categorically reject any attempts to undermine Syrian sovereignty, alter its demographic composition, and fragment its territory. Regrettably, the Council's recent prudential statement failed to address these violations. Israel's continued illegal occupation of the Syrian Golan is defiance of international law, the UN Charter, Council resolutions, and 1974 disengagement agreement must end without delay. Finally, we reaffirm our conviction that the only sustainable path forward for Syria is a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process facilitated by the United Nations in full conformity with the core principles of the Security Council Resolution 2254. Such a process must safeguard the legitimate right of aspiration of all Syrians while preserving the sovereignty, independence, unity, and national institutions of Syria. In this context, we note the ongoing preparation of indirect election for the interim parliament. These efforts must be part of a broader, genuinely inclusive political process that ensure representation and legitimacy. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de la República.
I thank the delegation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I now give the floor to Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like also to thank to the United Nations Special Envoy, Mr. Pedersen, and the USG, Mr. Fletcher, Ambassador Fletcher, for their briefings. I really highly value their efforts and calls for sufficient sustained funding of assistance and for improving investment climate in the country. Mr. President, Syria continues to remain high on the international agenda. The new period requires sustained efforts to secure peace and stability on the basis of the country's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity. Empowering the Syrian administration is crucial to achieve this goal. We must not allow our focus to deviate from the essential task of restoring stability and security in the country. Syrian government itself is committed to strengthening security for its people and its territory. A centralized administration and a unified national army are indispensable to achieving this objective. Turkey has accordingly stepped up its efforts to support Syria's capacity building, including through training and advisory assistance. Despite facing many challenges, Syrian administration has taken tangible steps in recent months toward restoring institutions, protecting sovereignty, and serving the citizens. Syrians who had been living abroad in exile or in displacement have begun to return. Economic investment has started to flow into the country, also in modest way. Infrastructure, energy, and reconstruction projects have been launched. Sanctions have begun to ease, and Syrian authorities have engaged in constructive and positive dialogue with regional neighbors and with international actors. We call on the removal of remaining sanctions for the Syrian administration to deliver and serve its citizens. With sustained regional cooperation and international support, these efforts can deliver results more quickly than many expect. Mr. President, we all agree that the vision for a new Syria must be one where all communities, faiths, and cultures feel equally respected and protected, where coexistence replaces division and unity is not only preserved but strengthened. Turkey has consistently advocated for such an inclusive and constructive vision. However, recent developments in Sueda once again demonstrate the destructive and destabilizing nature of Israeli policies in the region. In this regard, we stress the importance of regional security built on the weaknesses of or instability of neighbors, but on their prosperity and stability. Efforts that undermine Syrian sovereignty or fuel fragmentation carry serious risks of broader regional destabilization. It is therefore essential that all actors consider the wider consequences of their actions. Destabilizing actions which threaten Syria's unity, stability, and the welfare of its people should not be tolerated. We are in close consultation with international and regional partners to prevent destabilizing moves towards Syria. In this regard, Turkey strongly supported the series of meetings held in Amman that brought together the United States, Jordan, Syria, and southern tribal leaders in search of peaceful solutions. Such initiatives must be encouraged and sustained. Mr. President, implementation of the 10th March agreement between the Syrian government and the so-called SDF is of crucial importance. We have yet to see credible steps from the SDF that will reduce tensions or contribute to an environment of security and trust. Its members from other countries have not left Syria yet. Additional pressure must be exerted on the so-called SDF, which seeks to prolong uncertainty and exploit potential crises for gain. It continues its attempts to draw new elements from the Syrian social fabric into a unilateral and malign agenda that runs counter to the authority of central institutions and undermines both the unity and integrity of the country. In this regard, we reiterate our call for the SDF to be dissolved and disarmed. Mr. President, international community must stand with Syria's people and government to ensure the positive agenda. Those who seek to create crisis, exploit sectarian divides, or deepen fault lines must not be allowed to prevail. Keeping things on the right track in Syria is a common and shared responsibility. The period ahead requires for the engagement with the Syrian government and closer international cooperation. With our collective support, Syria can move decisively toward unity, sovereignty, and peace. Turkey will remain fully committed to this vision. Thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de Turquía.
I thank Turkey for your statement, and I give the floor to Qatar.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's my honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Arab Group. We commend your presidency of the Security Council this month. We thank Special Envoy for Syria, Mr. Pedersen, and USG Fletcher for their comprehensive briefings. Mr. President, Syria is at a critical juncture, overshadowed by security, humanitarian, economic, and development challenges that affect the living conditions of the Syrians and overwhelm state institutions. While concerted national efforts continue to address these challenges, international support is needed to put the country on the path to recovery and reconstruction, which will reflect positively on stability in Syria and neighboring countries. The Arab Group underscores the importance of national unity under the umbrella of the state and its institutions. It's equally important to build trust, restore security and stability, achieve development, and advance a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned inclusive political process with the broad participation of all components of the Syrians. This will safeguard rights and promote national reconciliation, civil peace, and transitional justice. We welcome the Syrian government's measures to achieve these goals. We commend its cooperation with the international community and the United Nations and underscore the importance of the United Nations' role in supporting national efforts to this end. The group upholds Syria's national unity, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. We reject any violation of Syria's territorial integrity and sovereignty. We reject any external interference in Syria's affairs and any attempts to stoke strife, impose illegal realities on the ground, or push for any form of division or partition or fragmentation. The group is deeply concerned over acts of violence that aim to undermine Syria's security and stability. The group strongly condemns the violations by the Israeli occupying forces in Syria. They are a flagrant violation of Syria's sovereignty, international law, and the Charter of the United Nations. They also pose a direct threat to regional peace and security. We reject any pretext invoked to justify these hostile policies and this irresponsible conduct that pose a grave threat to regional and international security. We call on the Security Council to shoulder its responsibilities, to compel the occupying forces to immediately cease its violation, respect Syria's sovereignty, and fully withdraw from the entirety of the occupied Syrian territories. The occupying force must also respect the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement and abide by the mandate of UNDOF. The entirety of the Syrian Arab Golan remains an occupied territory in accordance with international law, international legitimacy, and relevant Security Council resolutions, mainly resolutions 242, 338, and 497. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Syria requires an urgent and coordinated international response. Institutional and technical support must be provided to build the state's capacity to meet basic needs, carry out early recovery projects, rehabilitate infrastructure, and attract investment. These are critical steps to improve living conditions and create a climate conducive for the safe, voluntary and dignified return of refugees and IDPs to their regions of origin. The group commends host countries that have shared the burden over the past years. Not a single country can bear this burden alone. This requires adequate and sustained financial and technical support from the international community. We underscore the need to increase the funding of the HRP to achieve urgent humanitarian objectives. Lifting economic restrictions and unilateral measures is essential to ease the plight of civilians and facilitate recovery, rehabilitation, and development. The group has welcomed statements by international partners, mainly the US and EU, on lifting or easing these restrictions. These are important positive steps and must be complemented by the full and immediate lifting of all sanctions that hinder the Syrian government's efforts to achieve its objectives. We welcome the humanitarian, economic, financial, and diplomatic support by member states to help improve living conditions and achieve development in Syria. Mr. President, we reiterate that Syria's security and stability is an integral part of Arab and regional security. Preserving the unity of Syria and its national institutions is the real guarantee to prevent regional destabilization, combat terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, and prevent the re-emergence of terrorist groups. We reiterate our full support for Syria's efforts to combat terrorism, secure borders, and counter weapons and drug smuggling. Cooperation must be strengthened to buttress regional security and combat transnational threats. We call on the Syrian government to pursue its cooperation with the international community to address terrorist threats and uproot terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Arab Group reiterates collective commitment to supporting the Syrian Arab Republic at this critical juncture, away from any destructive external interference, thus allowing Syrians to achieve and to enjoy peace, dignity, and prosperity. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco a la delegación de Qatar su...
I thank Qatar for your statement. There are no further names on the list of speakers. I now invite members of the Council to informal consultations to continue consideration of this item. The meeting is adjourned.